Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bullis, and I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, hosted in partnership with the Freedom Initiative, around our recent jointly produced report, Abusive. Years, Egyptian authorities have weaponized travel bans and travel-related restrictions in a politically motivated manner to silence and control critical voices, from academia to civil society. Often thought of as an administrative measure, these bans have had life-shattering impacts on the lives of Egyptian citizens. They've restricted their ability to pursue academic and professional opportunities, to seek critical healthcare, and to reunite with loved ones. The ambiguous legal content and context in which they operate, and the Byzantine processes that individuals subject to bans and their lawyers must navigate to solicit information and challenge them renders this issue a pressing priority for Egypt's human rights agenda. So today, our panelists will consider a number of questions, including what legal framework governs these bans, who is being targeted, how are bans imposed and experienced, and what can be done to address this abusive practice. Before we begin, I want to remind our audience that today's conversation is being recorded. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag TIMEP events. And as audience members, we of course invite you to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any time. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's wonderful moderator, Margot Ewan. Margot is the director of Freedom House's Political Prisoners Initiative, a major new project to support human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists who are detained in retaliation for their heroic work. Margot, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Audrey. It's my honor to be part of such an important event co-hosted by TIMEP and the Freedom Initiative on the abuse of travel bans in Egypt. This critical issue has affected far too many, whether they're human rights activists, academics, journalists, those who have been politically imprisoned, or even everyday Egyptians who find themselves at the mercy of the authorities. Too often, travel bans escape attention because those affected aren't in a physical jail cell, but this abusive and unjust restriction of liberty is increasingly being used as a tool of repression, and we must all work together to stop this practice and hold those responsible accountable. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Patrick Zaki, who is an Egyptian researcher, activist, and postgraduate scholar at the University of Bologna, Italy, conducts research and advocacy on minority issues in the Middle East and North Africa region. He was detained on February 7th, 2020, though recently released. He remains on trial for alleged crimes related to opinion and expression. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today with all of you, and a great opportunity to discuss my experience with being on a travel ban. I was released from the prison last December after being detained for 18 months. I think so, yeah, 18 months. And since my release, I have been put on a travel ban. I'm a master's student in Italy, and I was detained from the airport or kidnapped from the airport after my arrival. Throughout my imprisonment, all what I wanted or I was thinking about was that I want to be released to resume my master's degree in Italy, to resume my studies, and this is what I was thinking all the way about. And even when I was released, I was darkly thinking about it. I have been 8 months since my release till now, and there is no signs or lifting that the travel ban will be solved, and I can't even predict when it's going to an end. The travel ban is taking a huge toll on my career. If I'm not able to be then by the next September in Italy, I might lose my chance to resume my studies. Even the scholarship is in a high risk because it was freeze 3 years or 2 years and a half already. I really worked hard for this, and I worked for 3 years before to obtain this chance to be resuming my career in my master's and even getting the scholarship. On the other hand, most importantly, my fiance or girlfriend is currently doing her master's degree in Italy. And we were supposed to be getting our degree together there, only to find ourselves forced to be separated again by distance once more after being separated by the prison walls. I long for the time where I can go back to being as a free person. I need my freedom of mobility, and I certainly need to compensate for the years I have lost both for my career and for my relationship. The travel is ruining my life. The only dream that I had when I was in my cell again was this, to travel and to get my normal life again. It's depriving me for my partner and limiting my ambitions, and the two most important things for me in my life right now. I saw that I paid for my activism throughout the 2 years in the imprisonment. I never thought that I still be paying after being released again. Um, I'm certainly grateful to be out of the prison. It's a privilege, I know, but it's not the full freedom. I'm with my family, but I can't travel with them. I can't see my girlfriend where she is, like in Europe. I believe that I have the right to get my full freedom. My case is not like irregular. There are tens of other human rights defenders who are still on a travel ban. First, one of them that I can talk about is my colleague Karim Annara, who are like on a travel ban for 1 year and a half till now. His wife in England, and he can reach her or can resume his normal life to be with her there. I know that Karim will talk like in details about this today, but it's an important case to put the spot over. And not only Karim, but also Gasser Abdelrazak, my mentor and my former director in EIPR, and our colleague Mohammed Bashir. They have the asset freeze and they have like the travel ban. In addition to those, who like the people know, we have another like people who are on a travel ban since a lot of years, not only like 1 or 2 years, like Hussein Bahgat, the founder and the current director of the IPR. I'm really appreciating that I was here today. I know that I talked a lot and a little bit fast, but I have like a little bit of time. Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to share my struggles about the travel ban, and I hope that everyone can take his full freedom very soon. And finally, I want to have a small note about, we are talking today about the travel ban, but we can't forget to talk about that everyone should think about Ala Al-Fattah. He's in a horrible situation and everyone should think about him. Thanks a lot, and it was my pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Patrick. We also hope that your situation will soon be resolved, and it's awful to hear about the devastating impact it's had on your life and your family's life that no one should have to go through. So now that we've heard from Patrick, I am very pleased to introduce our panel for our discussion today, starting with Karim Inara, who's a research advisor for the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, or EIPR. Until December 2020, he was the director of their criminal justice unit, but his prosecution and arrest forced him to take leave of his duties, and is currently, as Patrick said, himself under travel ban. El Sadani is the managing director and legal and judicial director at TIMEP, making some of the most pressing legal accountability and transitional justice issues across the MENA region more accessible for a policy audience. Alison McManus is the Freedom Initiative's research director with over a decade of experience on critical human rights issues in the Middle East and North Africa. And prior to joining Freedom Initiative, she worked as research director at TIMEP. And James Lynch is the co-director of Fair Square, a London-based human rights organization with a focus on authoritarianism, which early impacts of travel bans on civil society in Egypt. Previously worked in the Middle East and North Africa program for Amnesty International and for the UK Foreign Office. So Karim, let's start with you. I think it's really important for people watching this conversation to understand the personal impact of what it's like to be under travel ban, as we heard from Patrick. And I'd love to know more about how your travel ban has impacted your life and your ability to do your work, but also to be with your family in the UK, and what challenges have you encountered in trying to get the UK government to help you resolve this situation?
Thank you, Margot. Can you guys hear me clearly? Just want to make sure the connection is not choppy. So I'm going to try to, I had a few points I wanted to talk about. I'm going to try to respond to your questions while talking about these things. I am aware of the time constraint, so I'll kind of superficially address some of these issues, and hopefully we'll delve deeper into them in the Q&A. But I really wanted to thank you all, first of all, for like giving me this opportunity. This is the first time that I've kind of spoken on a public platform about this issue since I've been out of, since I've come out of prison in December 2020. And as you said, and as Patrick said, I've been living under a travel ban and an asset freeze since then. And during the course of those 18 months, there are a couple of issues that I think are like really worth noting here, which don't often receive as much attention when people talk about the abuse of this pattern of the state abusing travel bans and asset freezes to persecute civil society members, human rights defenders, journalists, what have you. The first thing which I would like to start by highlighting is that in my case, and in the case of my colleagues, Gasser and Bashir, who are my co-defendants in the case, and in a lot of other cases, but not everyone, not case 173, for instance, the famous NGO case, it's easy to forget that we have a travel ban and asset freeze on account of terrorism charges, which is a really big thing. So it's important to also bring this back to the main issue of how anti-terror laws are being weaponized. They provide the legal background and the legal context for either detention or travel bans and asset freezes and other like non-custodial measures that has that effect on people's lives. The legal context for this is, you know, people being prosecuted in exceptional courts for terrorism charges. And that's not just in Egypt. It's a global problem of how like anti-terror laws in the last 20 years have become weaponized against civil society, human rights defenders, journalists, political activists, what have you. And the other thing is that I know, and again, we almost don't talk about this. We don't ask. The easier way for these measures to be lifted is for these charges to be dropped because they're politically motivated charges. You know, everyone knows that this is not a real case. But I don't even think of that. No one advocates for that because it's so normalized that I will likely live with the charge of being a terrorism suspect for the rest of my life. The best case scenario for me is that I don't directly suffer the consequences of that. I'm not in prison, measures such as travel bans and asset fees are lifted, and then I'm allowed to go on living my life with this in the background, knowing that this will always be in the background because they'll never drop these charges. So that's number one. The other thing, the second issue I wanted to highlight is, I know this is mostly about travel bans, but in Egypt at least, travel bans are typically coupled with asset freezes. There are a few exceptions to this. I think Patrick is actually one of these exceptions, but usually they're interconnected. They usually go together, and together they have a significant ability to wreck people's lives. You can travel, you can do what you used to do. You don't really have freedom of movement or freedom of speech, and you can't do a lot of work. Sometimes you can't work at all, because the thing about asset freezes that a lot of people don't know is that it's not just whatever money you have in the bank that you don't have access to. It's that you're not allowed to be in the banking system, which effectively shuts you out of the market for a lot of jobs. I've had job offers that were withdrawn because of the complications involved in either not being able to travel or not having a bank account. My colleague Gasser as well, he had a lot of jobs withdrawn, not just because of that, but because international organizations don't want to hire someone who's implicated in a political anti-terror case. It just comes with a lot of headache. And you can't predict what's going to happen with that. Maybe he'll land in jail again randomly after 2 years. My colleague Bashir, he's our co-defender who was also on a travel ban and asset freeze. He can't pay his son's university tuition. We don't know how long he's going to go on for that, like that. But we just have to plow on because, you know, what other options do you have? You have no legal recourse, and it's considered a small issue in the context of human rights issues in Egypt, which it is. You know, if you look at the hierarchy of things, it's not as big as some of the other challenges of people lingering in pretrial detention for years and so many other issues, or like death penalty, whatever. And it's difficult, and that brings me to the third point, which hopefully will be my final point, and then, you know, if I haven't addressed everything you wanted me to talk about, Margot, I can do it in the second round of question, which is how difficult it is to raise this issue, how difficult it is to complain about how it's wrecking your life because, you know, it doesn't have a lot of spectacle. I've been under this travel ban for 20 months now. Some of my colleagues like Hossein Bahagat, the founder of VIPR, has had it for 6 years or more. A lot of other colleagues in other NGOs have had it for 5, 6, 7 years. There's about, if you just look at, as mentioned in the report, that the TIMEP and Freedom Initiative report, it's really hard to know how many people have travel bans. There isn't a lot of transparency about this, not like there's a database you can access, but at least I know that within civil society, there's about 19 people who, for similar reasons, because of their work in human rights organizations, have had the travel ban for something between 6 months and like 7 years. It's kind of difficult to know the exact figure because, you know, a couple of people have actually had the travel ban lifted in the last year. But I think it's around 19 at the moment. Our colleagues, May and Alison, will talk more about the legal vacuum. They've done a lot of research on this that allows for this abuse and the life cycle of travel bans. But let me tell you about something else other than the legality. In the context of Egypt, because, you know, this is not really legal. The way I think I could get this travel ban lifted is by like basically advocacy and political mobilization and talking to the state through our interlocutors and trying to tell them that, listen, you have nothing to fear of us, and that's, I'm being perfectly honest here, or like diplomatic intervention for whatever people who have access to that. But it's a genuinely difficult issue to raise, especially in Egypt, where there are so many other problems and human rights issues and challenges, and it could go on forever being like that. You know, even raising it, not just with decision makers and policy people, but even with colleagues who work with me in the same organization, colleagues that I've worked with for 10 years in legal aid and human rights, that are trying to defend human rights and civil liberties in Egypt. I'm out of jail. I spent 2 weeks in pre-trial detention, which is a huge victory in the context of Egypt. I can't deny that. And, you know, going to prison in political cases for just 2 weeks here is considered, it's almost like you didn't go to prison. Like they just dropped you off at the gate and then they let you go. Usually the minimum is like 6 months. So people don't think that you have other issues, that you're still being persecuted. I've been at meetings with policymakers, with human rights people, with lawyers, where, you know, they don't say that directly, but between the lines, you're told that this is almost a small price to pay for not being in prison. And, you know, when I tell a colleague, for instance, who's meant to be sympathetic to my case, I'm separated from my wife, and they ask, like, well, is she legally not allowed to be in Egypt? And I say that she is. She doesn't have any problems. They're all coming to Egypt. But ultimately, we spend 2 to 3 months a year together for the last 2 years. That is separation from you. Technically, legally, it's not. It's having a significant impact on my life and on her life. And it happens invisibly almost. And that's the dilemma, because, in fact, it is a small price to pay. If you're going to make me choose between this and between what a lot of other colleagues that are suffering. Patrick spent 20 months in prison before he ended up with this travel ban. A lot of, you know, I have a case like Walid, he spent 6 months in prison and now he's been on travel ban for like, what, 4 or 5 years. And a lot of people spend 3-4 years in pre-trial detention. People suffer significantly worse fates. But this is still a form of persecution, and it's very effective because of that in particular, because it's always being drawn into these comparisons. It's almost undetected, and people's lives are affected or wrecked in various ways. And on top of that, it comes with the uncertainty of, you know, potentially going on for entire lifetimes. It's disproportionate, it's arbitrary, it's unconstitutional, and you never know when it's going to end, and there's no legal recourse. And so you just, you know, you celebrate the fact that, you know, I'm better off than many other people. You live with that survivor's guilt. But that's it. You don't know, your life is significantly affected by it. You don't have, your income is affected. You don't have jobs. You're not able to be with your family, but you're not in prison. It's a dilemma, and, you know, I'm going to stop at this, but I'm hoping this will open up like questions and get the conversation flowing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. You've already you know, got some questions from the audience that we'll address in the audience question round, and I'll definitely be coming back to get into some more specifics of what you've shared. But thank you so much for sharing this for the first time publicly, because I think the more people know about this, the more likely we can then take steps to address it. So May, I want to go to you next to ask you a little bit more about the legal framework of these travel bans. What's their life cycle? Can people challenge them? Are there any recourse? I know, you know, Kareem just said there wasn't, but I'm wondering if you've identified in your research any options that people might have.
Thank you, Margot. So I want to start by inviting the audience to imagine this scenario with me. Imagine you have a trip planned for work, to see your best friend, to get highly needed medical care. You've packed and you've prepped for days, and you're now at the airport. And instead of making it to your gate, you're stopped at check-in by a security airport official, and you're told that you won't be able to travel today. You're given little to no information about why or who has issued this prohibition. Perhaps you're taken in for questioning for a couple of hours at the airport. Sometimes you're told to try and travel a different day, come tomorrow or come in a few days. Other times you're told that you're just not allowed to travel and you're asked to go home. And other times still, your passport is actually physically confiscated. And almost all Egyptians banned from travel, be they civil society advocates or not, first learn that they're actually banned at the airport. They're not told who issued the ban, why it's been issued, or for how long it may be in place. For those who've never been detained or questioned pending a case, this becomes even more puzzling. After you go home, there's no one path through which to solicit information about the ban. You see, some bans are issued in relationship to an existing legal case and through a judicial order, but others are issued by the security apparatus, where you might appear on a security list, but it's unlikely for this ban, for this order to have any form of paper trail. Those who are banned from travel have tried to solicit information about their ban informally. Sometimes they filed inquiries before the prosecution or with the state council, and others have tried to actually recover their passports when they've been taken at NSA offices and learn more that way. They end up learning very little, and they receive even less in the form of documentation. In fact, one individual we spoke to when we were doing our research told us that it took her 1 year to get just a letter stating that she was on travel ban and in relation to which case. So a year in the court system. These bans are shredded by an immense amount of legal ambiguity, like you were saying in question, and like Karim alluded to. There is no single domestic law governing all travel bans. Rather, there's only a Ministry of Interior decree that has been amended on a few occasions, and that decree lists the entities that are authorized to request for the passport authority to impose a ban. These entities include judicial actors, like you might expect, prosecutors, investigative judges who might be involved in a case, but they also include non-judicial actors, like the heads of general intelligence and the head of the National Security Agency. While technically this administrative decree says that those banned from travel can have their names lifted after a 3-year period, in practice, the decree gives authorities the right to keep individuals on this list beyond the 3-year period, to renew it, and without any time limit and with absolute discretion. The decree states, albeit vaguely, that those wishing to challenge the ban can submit something called a grievance. And in fact, this is what many of the individuals banned who we spoke to for our research did. In practice, though, there's no clarity on where these grievances should be submitted, and the vast majority end up in criminal court. Though on occasion, there are that actually being heard by a terrorism circuit. In practice, involving bans issued to an ongoing remains open, whether or not the person is in detention or has been in detention, are effectively always denied. Grievances involving travel bans issued by a security order largely never make it to or through the court system because there's no judicial order and it's been issued by a security apparatus and there's no paper trail. In the vast majority of cases we documented for this research, grievances were unsuccessful. It often required political will for travel bans to be issued or a case to be closed in its entirety, which again, often requires political will. When a case has been closed, at times travel bans have been lifted automatically, and at other times, folks have actually had to file grievances to guarantee implementation. So even in those cases where the cases are resolved, there's still an additional step. Egypt's application of travel bans in the absence of a domestic legal framework and without transparency, without notice, with serious due process violations, violates not only international standards, but it violates Egypt's own constitution, which very clearly states in no unequivocal terms that no citizen may be banned from leaving state territory except with a causal judicial order for a specified period of time in cases specified by the law. Instead, we have authorities that have failed to issue a law to even govern travel bans and to treat them as a measure of last resort, to place restrictions on them. We have none of that. Instead, we've seen the expansion of the authorities of a security apparatus allowed to abuse these bans outside of any legal framework and making what little exists of the law moot. Egypt's own Supreme Constitutional Court and Supreme Administrative Court have both noted this legal vacuum in their decisions in a number of court orders. As my colleagues will tell you, and I hope as this conversation will demonstrate to the audience, these bans are not just administrative measures, but they're life-shattering orders. They separate loved ones, they destroy relationships, they create financial burden and job loss, they deny individuals access to education, they're imposed arbitrarily and for reasons of opinion, expression, association, but even sometimes as a form of reprisal for what a family member has said or done. And I hope today's event really drives home the gravity of all of this, and that we can spend a significant part of the conversation thinking about why it's critical and how we can engage to change all of this.
Thank you, May, for all of that really helpful context. Really upsetting to hear just how frustrating that would be for folks to not even have any answers about what is impacting their travel ban and their asset freezes that might accompany them. Allison, I want to turn to you and ask you a little bit more about the research that you've done on how this impacts people physically, psychologically, socially, professionally. We've touched on that a little bit with May and Kareem and Patrick's testimonies, but I think it would be helpful to hear a little bit more, since you guys have focused on this aspect in your research, and also what are any policy recommendations that you might have, specifically with the U.S. government, because I know the Freedom Initiative has worked quite a lot to pressure the U.S. to do more.
Thanks so much, Margot. So I guess first I want to start by acknowledging, the interventions that Patrick made, and his and Kareem's, just their very participation in this event is quite courageous, and I think it underscores, some of the impact that you're talking about, Margot. The fact that Kareem mentioned this is the first time that he's spoken about this travel ban, despite having been living with it for many years. And I'm sure many of those in the audience remember when Kareem was detained and there was a massive, global campaign to advocate for his release. And yet since then, he's been living in this nightmare, as he described it, for many, many months, and without the ability really to speak out about it, because he's stuck in this dynamic by which he could be detained again at any moment. So when we were approaching some of the research for the travel ban on this report, we realized that one, it is very difficult for those who are on travel ban to speak out because of the nature of the vulnerability that they're experiencing. Unlike others who may be able to leave to relative safety outside of Egypt, that's simply not possible for those on travel ban, which does make it much more difficult to speak publicly. And that's also why you'll notice in our research, of all of those we interviewed, only one was willing to actually be identified by name. So I want to emphasize that, as May said, it is that harassing nature of showing up to the airport, realizing that, your plans are going to be destroyed, but then also that you're going back home and you're still stuck in the same repressive structure that may have caused you to be detained to begin with. I also think it's important here to note, the scope of the bans, and May talked about this a little bit. When we approach the research, there's been a lot of documentation and focus on those who are detained because of their civil society work, because of their activism, but actually most of those that we interviewed for our report were not civil society actors. These aren't folks whose names you would necessarily recognize. There are cases of folks who are public. I know Kareem mentioned Walid Salam. This is somebody who is a scholar, whose scholarship was actually not necessarily even politically controversial. One of the people that we interviewed is a psychologist. We know of another case, Reda Abdurrahman. This is one that many of you, a name that many of you will recognize, because Reda was also a political prisoner. He's a school teacher and a blogger, and he's part of the Quranist, religious minority in Egypt. So he was also targeted for his religious views. When he was released, he also tried to travel to see family in the United States and was denied. He's said that he's okay with mentioning this. And again, this would be the first time that anybody's publicly mentioned that he's on travel ban as well. So there's a wide scope of those who are banned from travel. And so it will impact different lives differently, because for some who maybe have access to wider international networks, are able to advocate, et cetera, there is more ability to speak out, and for others there's not. So I wanted, like I said, to mention the scope, the difficulty it is just simply for people to even talk about the issue of travel bans. And then to return to your question about what some of the impact is, I mean, I think that Kareem and Patrick, very, they spoke to their own experiences in a way that I think is quite powerful. I'll also mention, because I know we had a question in the audience about, why the Egyptian government would use these travel bans, the broader impact that they have. So less the individual impact, but more the broader impact. Again, this chilling effect, I think, is very important to note. This is in some ways detention by other means. It's obviously not equivalent to what it means to be in prison in terms of the personal experience and the violation of rights. But I'm more talking about the inability to speak freely, to associate freely, not only within Egypt, but also to those outside of Egypt. So I think there are also dynamics of transnational repression that we could identify when we're talking about these bans. We know that the Egyptian government has been, in some cases, strategic about using them against those, of course, who they believe will end up traveling and who could then speak to interlocutors outside the United States, or excuse me, outside of Egypt, whether that's, in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, et cetera. So I think that that's an important dynamic to outline as well. When it comes to, US policy efforts, I think that for many of the reasons that we've already discussed, it's been difficult to gain traction to get policy attention on that. First, there's the definitional issues. And, Margot, this is something that you and I had explored quite a bit, like what exactly is the violation that's happening because of the travel ban? Of course, there's a violation to freedom of movement. And I won't go into this too much, but maybe it's something that we could return to. Freedom of movement is also not something that's very well defined in international law. And even, there is precedent for using travel bans even in other contexts that's outside of Egypt, right? So exactly what is it that we are bringing to the US government to say this is a violation that's occurring? Again, because the scope is so unknown, we often hear, how big of a problem is this? And then trying to explain, well, the ambiguous nature of the bans, the invisible nature of the bans, the fact that so many people are afraid to speak up makes it impossible to know how many people are on travel bans. So outlining the scope of the issue in a way that would really underscore, how big of a problem is can be difficult. And then, of course, the sort of triage that we find policymakers need to do. Rightfully so, when we have cases like Patrick mentioned, Ala Abdel Fattah, who's on a hunger strike and whose health is deteriorating and he can't get a family visit. I mean, that is something that's immediately urgent. And that's something else that the Egyptian government, I think, is very adept at doing, is being able to have cases that are continue to have these constantly urgent cases. And then at the same time, for those where, okay, again, in Kareem's case, the urgency is subsided because he's released. But then there's this slow, continuous repression that's happening, but that's much more difficult to get attention on. We can go into recommendations a little bit more, but just generally, I mean, I think we try to emphasize it's a matter of looking at these as part and parcel of a larger infrastructure of repression. It's also a matter of saying that, well, yes, travel bans may be used in other contexts. I'm actually going to borrow something that James said recently, like jail is also used in other contexts as well, right? We're not talking about the fact that travel bans exist in Egypt. It's about the ways in which they're abused. As Maya mentioned, these should be used as in only the most exceptional cases that are justified by law. And that is simply not happening. So there does not need to be this kind of equivocation or equivalency that's happening. I'll leave it there and we can go into more details, but I want to give some time for James and to answer other questions as well.
Thank you, Allison. Yes, we'll definitely come back to recommendations, before we open it up to audience Q&A, because I do think we should talk about what we think we can do to counter this. But James, I would love to hear from you about, specifically your report with Human Rights Watch and the focus on the impact among civil society, obviously it's incredibly important to highlight how the Egyptian government is trying to target human rights defenders and those trying to reform democracy and freedoms within Egypt, and how the bans are being used against them. And perhaps you also have some thoughts either now or in our second round of interventions on what policymakers should be doing, in the UK, but also at the international level and the European Union.
Thank you. Thanks, Margot. And thanks everyone else for their interventions. Yeah, I was going to speak a little bit to some of the research that Fair Square has done with Human Rights Watch, earlier this month, alongside Freedom Initiative and TIMEP, on the impact of civil society, and I guess picking up some of the themes that came through those discussions. I think I just wanted to flag, early on, in a way, internationally, when you look at what Western governments say, protection of civil society is supposed to be a big international priority. So President Biden says democracy is the defining challenge of our time. And if you look at his, his initiative for democratic renewal, working with civil society, protecting and supporting civil society is a huge part of that strategy. Borrell has said, the High Representative for the EU has said that partnership with civil society is in the EU's DNA, and the British sort of national security strategy, called the Integrated Review, says that working with civil society and human rights defenders is a key priority for the strategy, a key priority action. So this is supposed to be, at least in theory, a key priority. And we know in Egypt, this is something that, foreign embassies and foreign ministries in Europe and North America, they take a close interest in the situation for Egyptian civil society. Their support, as people, my co-panelists will know better than me, can often be very muted. It can be only at select moments and a bit inconsistent. But it is there. They take the opportunities to seek releases of prisoners and to draw attention to problematic laws and practices. I guess the issue is that when it comes to travel bans, and I think some of the other panelists, particularly Kareem, spoke to this, it's a weak spot. Travel bans are sort of fly under the radar. They get mentioned in statements, for example, at the Human Rights Council. But because they often come as an alternative to or after a prison sentence, they are often sort of seen as a less problematic practice. And I think we've kind of covered that issue. I wanted to look at, though, so therefore, what is the impact of travel bans on Egyptian civil society? What did the people under the bans tell us about that? I think the word we used was throttling. That the bans help to throttle civil society. And to stop it playing the kind of healthy and active role that it should do. Alison's spoken a little bit to how, those under travel bans, who are the key leading figures in Egyptian civil society in many cases, are demoralized and demotivated by under these bans. So we've talked about the personal impact. Kareem has described, and Patrick, the personal and professional impact on them, the kind of long-term demotivation that causes. I also wanted to speak to the impact this has on the next generation of the human rights movement. That was something that came through very strongly. How do you recruit a new member of a human rights organization in Egypt when people can see that when your career progresses, this is potentially what's in store for you, and that's assuming that you aren't targeted for arrest, that you may not be able to be with your spouse, that you may not be able to take forward your dream job. For example, you can't, if like Nasser Amin, you've worked for years on an ICC case on Darfur, you can't present because you're under a travel ban. Or if you win an international award like Mahye Noor El Masri, you can't collect it. So these are the kinds of things that, how do you recruit and then how do you promote? So we heard a lot of stories about people who had asked not to be promoted into more senior positions in civil society organizations, not to take on that additional responsibility and a more public profile. One human rights defender called this said that this sends a kind of terrifying message to the next generation. Alison flagged the fact that this chokes off international engagement. Egyptian civil society has been, largely unable to engage in person at UN sessions around Egypt. You can't develop those relationships with foreign parliaments, officials, and media, but the government can. So Egyptian government officials are free to travel, deliver those messages in person, build those relationships. Instead, for human rights defenders, they are left at the mercy of depending on digital communications, which, as we all know from the past couple of years, cannot be relied on, are not secure, however many precautions you take. And then I think the final thing I wanted to highlight on these impacts is, and Kareem, I think, flagged this as well. Travel bans provide a permanent, and long-term incentive to avoid raising your voice about both your own case and about other issues, because it's this incentive on that this might be a short-term thing, it might be lifted, this kind of constant limbo, and ultimately that results in people being silenced over the long haul. So I guess, Brenna, if I've got time, Margot, I was just going to touch on a few short sort of what could the international community do or do better. I think firstly, we need to take this seriously as a key part of the authoritarian playbook. It's not a technical measure. It's not a legal thing that can just be lifted with a slightly better legal strategy. So we need Western governments like the UK, like the EU, when they're advocating around prisoner releases, to make clear, and I'm borrowing here slightly from a Freedom Initiative and TIMEP recommendation, to make clear that a true release, an unconditional release, means one without a travel ban. I think exactly as Alison said, it's avoid this temptation to be sucked into the process, because these are arbitrary bans. There is no legal basis, that they are, illegitimate. And I think that quite often, I think foreign diplomats get too sucked into saying, well, we raised it with the Egyptian government. They said you hadn't submitted the right paper to the right court. Like that sort of conversation takes us nowhere. It sucks up energy and time. And I think, when you're looking at major areas of international cooperation, like the climate talks, we need to see travel bans as a part of this broader architecture of repression to be on the table. When Western governments are in these high-level planning dialogues, and they're looking at other critical human rights issues, travel bans, asset freezes need to be part of that discussion. Just a couple of other small things. I think that Western governments could do a lot more on direct support. One thing is whether, relief funds for people whose incomes have been badly affected by both bans and asset freezes, where people are in need, that should be a specific area of relief funding. I think the other thing is more formalized sort of quasi-consular support for cases like Kareem's or Patrick's, where people have a basis for entering another state, the state that they are trying to travel to. They should have much more formalized and much more resources to work on those cases, to treat them almost as if they were, national cases. And then the last thing, just to pick up and agree with Alison, I think there needs to be done internationally on the issue of travel bans. And again, picking up a recommendation from the FI TIMEP report, there is no UN special rapporteur on the freedom of movement. That could play a really helpful role to study and advocate around this issue, to make this case, to flag these patterns. Amnesty have been doing some really good work on travel bans in Saudi Arabia. We need to start seeing the way that these tactics are being adopted in one place, perfected in another. And I think a lot more could be done on that. So yeah, those are my 2 cents. Thanks.
Thank you, James, and thank you all for these first interventions. I'll just reiterate what some of you have said already, that while today's topic is focused on Egypt, I think that we all are aware that this is occurring in other countries, and that it's such a serious problem. It's almost like a new form of detention that probably costs the government a lot less money than holding physical bodies in a prison, and is easier for them to implement. So I think it's very important that we in civil society are being intentional about how to address this, and that's one of the reasons why the new initiative I'm running at the Freedom Initiative at the Freedom House on political prisoners, when we do research on, how many human rights defenders are detained around the world, we want to make sure that we're capturing those people who are actually affected by travel bans, exit bans, and other types of conditional measures, because I think that this has become such a frequent practice that we need to also be thinking about it in this, like you said, James, the broader context of authoritarian repression and the long-term impacts on civil society's ability to be effective in promoting democracy and freedoms. So I'm wondering if I know James, Kareem, and Allison have all referenced this during our discussion. Are there other countries besides Saudi Arabia and Egypt that we're aware of that are doing this? And do we have any kind of proof from the research that Egypt is kind of teaching them about how they've been successful at doing these bans and how that they're cooperating together to kind of continue this practice? Allison, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take that on. We do see it in other instances. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is certainly a country where we see this type of travel bans or exit bans, particularly those that are used against human rights defenders, civil society, or frankly, political prisoners who may be coming out of prison. Often in Saudi Arabia, however, the travel ban is part of a sentence that would be levied. And so in that case, while it does have kind of a coercive and repressive function, it's also a punitive measure that's codified in law. So in that case, it is a bit different than this type of wide-ranging, informal, and very ambiguous nature of the bans that we see in Egypt. In other cases, we've also seen, for instance, in China, different types of restriction of movement that are used in similar ways. And in particular, when we think about how Egypt uses the bans as a form of transnational repression, that's also something that we see in Saudi Arabia and in China, where there's an attempt to prevent, whether it's a Uyghur minority, again, in Saudi prisoners or in Egypt prisoners, from being able to leave the country and share information about the abuses that either they've experienced or they've witnessed in areas that are very, frankly, difficult for an international community to have visibility. So it's also a way to prevent, again, witnessing or testimony to large-scale human rights abuses that may be occurring in a domestic context.
Thank you, Allison. Go ahead, James.
And I was just going to add, Bahrain is a very prominent case of another government that's used it very systematically and specifically to prevent human rights defenders and activists from engaging with UN mechanisms.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's very important to be aware of the way that these regimes are influencing each other and cooperating with each other. And I think that's a good segue into kind of discussing a little bit more how the US government, the UK government, some of the international institutions that we mentioned should be working together to produce stronger policy responses. I'd love to get a little bit more information, Kareem, about your situation and what challenges you've had in engaging the UK government where your wife is residing, about how they should be helping you to get back. I know this is something that some Americans who are also affected by these travel bans in Egypt have also experienced difficulties dealing with their government. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your experience.
Did you say, sorry, let me get that straight. You said my experience is trying to engage the government, or did you say the UK government?
The UK government. Apologies about my connection.
Oh, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so just wanted to hear your experience engaging with the UK government.
Okay. I mean, I personally haven't really directly been doing that. My wife has been doing it with the help of a lot of friends and colleagues who are based in London, trying to engage the UK government, considering the fact that, she's a British citizen, she's my spouse, I have residency in the UK. And so trying to raise the issue and get UK policymakers, also considering that the UK is particularly well positioned right now because they're basically being the hosts of the COP26. They do have a big role to play in handing over the responsibilities of the COP organization, COP27, which will take place in Egypt. So they kind of work very closely together with the Egyptian government throughout this year. And this is meant to be one of the issues on the agenda. You know, if you're going to host the biggest climate event that happens every year, civil society freedom and freedom of speech should be definitely one of the issues on the agenda. So she's unfortunately not with us right now. I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of her because I don't know what kind of what kind of things she would want to say and what things for diplomatic reasons she wouldn't want to say. But I would say she's had mixed success. There's been a lot of sympathy in some circles from some individuals, but very broadly speaking, on an institutional level, especially when it goes to the highest levels, it's very similar to the dynamic I described when talking about trying to raise the issue domestically. It's not as high, on the priority list as other issues in relation to, human rights concerns in Egypt in general. There's been a lot more, since the publication of these couple of reports and the parliamentary letter, and because the COP is a few months away, there's been a little bit more, traction on these and various other issues. But it's still, every once in a while, it gets lost in not just the other human rights concerns. Patrick highlighted the case of Alaa. Obviously, cases like that will demand a lot more serious attention, and you always end up. I mean, it's quite like this has always been the case when you're working in human rights and civil liberties issues in Egypt. Back when I used to do that work, and I wasn't the case, there's always a very narrow bandwidth for human rights issues domestically, regionally, and internationally, and you're constantly having to shuffle your priorities. I used to do this very clinically. Used to be able to decide based on a certain calculus that I've developed based on my experience, what is the priority right now. And it's really difficult to do that calculus, because if I was doing it and I'm an outsider and I'm not the person concerned, I would demote me. I wouldn't be a very high case. I think she's had mixed success. I think she believes that now there's a little bit more attention compared to last year, immediately after our release. And I would say that domestically, I don't know if you would like me to speak about this a little bit as well, because I'm
Please feel free to
trying to do
share.
that. Yeah. And again, I'm not talking about the legality, because talking about I do try whatever legal recourse is in theory available. We've been trying to lodge an appeal against our asset freezes and travel bans for 18 months. We haven't, even the application for appeal has not been accepted. Gets lost in the counterterrorism code bureaucracy. Deliberately lost, obviously. But politically, we're talking with our interlocutors. I saw some of the questions. I quickly looked through the questions in a chat box. People asked us if we're engaging with the national dialogue process, if we're engaging with the National Council of Human Rights. We've been engaged from the very beginning with some interlocutors who directly speak to the state security agency, state security, and the National Human Rights Council. And we keep being told, oh, it's going to be sorted out. This is Patrick's experience. It's like, Patrick, since he's come out, he'd be like, oh, you're going to go back to your studies within 1 week, within 2 weeks, give us a couple of more days. This has been my experience. It's like vague promises and nothing happens. But we are engaged because we don't have many other options. And right now, we are trying to engage with the national dialogue process, which I don't think will achieve anything major. But like everything else in terms of opposition politics or human rights advocacy in Egypt, at the height of ambition, and this has been the height of my ambition, to be honest, working in this career in the last 4 years in Egypt, is to try to get small concessions. Any small concession we can get out of them is something. We can't really hope for more. So we've been, we've had the meeting a couple of weeks ago with other civil society members, and there was a general consensus that we're happy to even participate directly in the national dialogue process and raise several issues that, first of all, relate to civil society freedom, so that we can constructively engage with this process. If you want us to engage with human rights organizations, we're happy to. Please release our colleagues who are in prison and lift the travel bans and asset freezes. Give us a little bit of freedom to work so we can actually engage with you. Domestically, that's what's been happening in the last month. I don't know if it will be fruitful or not. Sorry if my answer is quite vague, but I try to address both issues, like domestically and internationally. Maybe James knows a little bit more about, trying to engage the UK government.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Kareem. James, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I suppose just to add from my perspective, maybe the broader context on the UK and and maybe how that relates to Kareem's case. I mean, the UK is like, I think, a lot of Western countries in something of a kind of mixed up position at the moment, because it is absolutely, you know, going full throttle anti-authoritarianism when it comes to Ukraine. You know, that is how that is being framed, that conflict. And yet, you know, this is a post-Brexit Britain that is seeking trade deals, that has, you know, very close and long-standing strategic partnerships in the Middle East with Egypt, you know, a key partner. And so, you know, I think when you then see, you know, what the recent visit we had of the Egyptian foreign minister to London to meet Liz Truss, the foreign secretary, who is, you know, potentially going to become prime minister shortly. When you look at what the real focus of that meeting, that was around, there was, of course, quite rightly, lots of human rights focus brought by, you know, the efforts of Jess, Kareem's wife, and also, of course, the team around Ala. But that was external focus. When you look at what the focus of the visit was, it was business. It was setting up an association agreement. There were lots and lots of details provided in the joint statement, all about these various points of economic and commercial cooperation. I think human rights was sort of buried somewhere in the 12th paragraph. So that's, I think, where, you know, where we are. It's pretty depressing. It's not clear that, you know, Truss, like, what did she say about human rights? Did she mention any individual cases? We don't really know. And it's depressing because, of course, you know, Kareem's case in a way is a great example of where international pressure can deliver results, right? So, and yet he now struggles because his case is kind of, you know, as he well describes, kind of been like relegated to this second layer. And where you have a country like UK, where the airtime is already narrow because the bandwidth is mostly focused on other issues, you know, can you get that airtime, that space? I guess I wanted to, you know, highlight, of course, that this doesn't mean that there aren't fantastic people in foreign ministries, in embassies, trying incredibly hard on these issues. It's just that, as you say, you know, as Kareem flagged, it's these strategic concerns and also the political leadership, you know, where these issues are simply not front of mind at the moment. But as I say, if you can generate the international pressure, I mean, why is it that Egypt has announced, you know, a year of civil society? Well, in part, that's because it came under some international pressure. It had, you know, the statement of 32 countries at the Human Rights Council. It's got the COP climate talk. So it can be a little disheartening when Egypt's international partners are unwilling to use the leverage that they undoubtedly do have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think from the human rights movement, you know, worldwide, we're seeing more and more human rights defenders who are suffering being put aside for economic reasons, economic advantages. And I think it's really important for us to all highlight the influence on the economy that these travel bans so clearly have, as well as, you know, political detentions in the traditional sense. Just really quickly before I turn it over to audience Q&A, we've got a lot of questions, so thank you people in our audience for being so engaged with this panel. I wanted to ask you, May, a little bit more about, you know, the international legal framework that we might be able to use to address these travel bans, because they are happening in more than one country, and that they continue to be used more frequently. So how can we address that through international cooperation?
Thanks, Margot. I think this is a really important point because, like what was said before, travel bans are not an Egypt problem alone. They're a global problem. They affect whether they are on Egyptian individuals or they're imposed by other countries on non-Egyptians. We're seeing this as a tool systematically used to silence folks, to as a form of reprisal or to kind of restrict various other rights. And I think it's critical as a first step that there be international attention on this issue. And because of the very nature of travel bans, the fact that they are sometimes, there is a paper trail and it might be possible to get a small scope of a small sense of the problem, but there's also so many undocumented travel bans. It's critical first that there be resources dedicated to understanding the scope of the issue. And that's why in our report, one of the recommendations we suggested is, you know, considering perhaps a UN special rapporteur on the right to freedom of movement, because in and of that role, there would be opportunity to document, to understand, to look at countries across the world to really get a sense of what's going on. And the reason we suggest this particularly, rather than just engaging with existing UN mechanisms, is because of something that's been highlighted throughout this conversation, but I think undersold, and that's travel bans are issued against civil society advocates, but they are also issued against family members, against doctors, against academics. So the existing UN mechanisms that exist do not necessarily cover the breadth of this issue. While the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders has done a great job looking at these issues as they affect human rights defenders, or perhaps a UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion could look at this issue affecting religious minorities, there isn't a comprehensive understanding of restrictions on the right to freedom of movement. And I think that's a really critical first step for us to understand the issue, to understand what it looks like, the numbers, the degree to which it affects people, what rights are implicated, and only then I think can we begin to have really effective interventions. There's so many things that can be done, right? Whether it's based on that, effective advocacy, bringing cases of affected individuals in foreign court, perhaps sanction submissions. But I do think a very first step is understanding the nature of the problem, recognizing that it's global and recognizing that it affects not just Egypt and Egyptians, but a global community.
Couldn't agree with you more. Definitely an important first step. And so I hope we can work together to make that happen, May. So I will start going through the questions from the audience, and I know we're limited on time, so I'll do my best to get to every question, and anybody on the panel who wants to answer it is really free to. So the first question that we have are about, under what circumstances have authorities ever removed travel bans, if that's ever possible. And yeah, I think some other points in that first question have already been addressed by Kareem. So if anyone can answer that, that would be great.
I can jump in and very quickly, and maybe Kareem also jump in. There have been a few cases that we looked at where travel bans were lifted largely as a result of political will. So years of advocacy, years of engagement, including on prominent cases like case 173, where finally the pressure amounted to a case being closed against an individual, and either the individual's ban was lifted automatically or they had to kind of file a grievance and implement that decision. There have been a handful of cases now where that has been the case, and we're all really happy for those individuals who are now able to travel. But because of I want to underscore just how much political will it took, how much advocacy it took, how much engagement it took. This is not kind of a systematic solution. The legal process that exists, imperfect, ineffective, is not a real pathway to lifting these bans. And so it pains me as a lawyer to say that really the most effective way to lift these bans is to create a lot of hell and draw a lot of attention to these cases. And that's a shame in and of itself.
Kareem, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to mention a few examples, and I also want to. I mean, I understand your pain, May, but I would like to take this opportunity to say that as lawyers who have to work in this kind of political sphere in Egypt, and like working in human rights, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, as just a reminder of the fact when you said that, the absence of legal recourse is very depressing for you as the lawyer. Most of our advice in anything, not just related to travel bans, about how for to people on how to stay out of trouble was to, as much as possible, try to avoid the law. Once you have to face the law, it's a very depressing situation. Anything that can be resolved with political negotiation, just don't be shy from that. And this is the reality for most things, for how people get out of prison, but also for how such measures are lifted. Now, obviously, like, it's very important also to highlight that there are 2 separate tracks in the legal system of Egypt, in the criminal justice system. One that's political, the state security courts and counterterrorism courts, and one that's the normal criminal justice system. In the normal criminal justice system, people have travel bans and get them lifted all the time for whatever reason, like every other country. I've seen, when I went to the passport authority to try to get a document that I obviously failed to get to prove that I have a travel ban, I met so many people like this. I know someone personally who, over a land dispute, some kind of financial dispute, he went to the airport, he was stopped from traveling, he was given a travel ban, he went to court, within 3 months he had it lifted once that dispute was settled. In the political parallel track, counter-terror courts and state security courts, that is almost impossible to happen. Everything is the outcome of a political negotiation. But once the political will exists, it takes like 2 minutes to sort this out. Now we have a case like May mentioned, case 173. A lot of people wouldn't know what that is, but this is a case, an investigation that's been open since 2011, where a lot of international as well as national NGOs were being prosecuted for their work, right? It's not a terrorism case, it's not in a terrorism court. And a lot of people have been, on account of this case, placed on travel bans and asset freezes, a lot of prominent human rights figures for, 4, 5, 6, and 7 years. Now, in the last 1 year, and probably because of a lot of domestic and international pressure, there's been promises for the government to close this investigation, which has been open for 11 years. And so they started actually in the last year. Maybe around 10 people have had their bans lifted, not the asset freezes, just the bans, but they were able to travel, they were able to regain, to some extent, their freedom of movement. Now, the thing about this case is that there were promises that everyone eventually will follow. That doesn't apply to me, but it applies to my colleague Hussein, for instance, because he's in case 173. And then at some point it stopped, it lost its momentum. And the reason is someone in decision-making circles realized that it's lost its momentum and that social media is already talking about case 173 as a closed case. And so they stopped. If they don't have to make concessions, they won't make them. Now we have to try to remind people that it hasn't been closed, that there's about 19 people who still have, 19 people, including affiliated counter-terror cases. I'd like to mention another case that is actually really interesting. It's a high-profile case of an opposition figure and writer, Amr Hamzawi, although this dates back to 2013, 2014, when he was put on a travel ban. Simpler times, basically. He kept raising the issue. He did a lot of he was separated from his family because of travel ban. And for about a year, he kept writing about it. And there was a lot of, he managed to create a lot of momentum until his ban was lifted and he was able to be reunified with his family, but he's not able to come back to Egypt. And just a couple of months ago, he seemed to, again, through a political negotiation, he was able to return to Egypt for the first time in 5 years, which is another really key thing. Freedom of movement that would, in its fullest sense, would mean that you're able to leave and you're able to come back, because we don't want to live, I don't want to live as an exile. Some people want to. I don't want to be opposition exile or anything like that. I want to be able to live with my family, and I want to be able to work in Egypt and come back to Egypt, which is a key thing that we also keep demanding. This is an important case because it worked in both ways, but it's quite rare. And again, it's the subject, obviously, of mostly political negotiation.
Allison?
Yeah, I just wanted to add as well, particularly for those bans that are not necessarily related to cases. And these aren't even mutually exclusive categories. There are some instances where somebody's maybe on a ban that's related to a case, but they're also present in this sort of informal manner on a security list. Often what people are told is you need to resolve this with the security apparatus, particularly the National Security Agency. And so what that means, and this is also, this applies to most, I would say, or at least many of those who are not higher profile, who aren't in, say, case 173, where it's a well-known case and their situation is well documented. It then requires that person needs to go and engage informally with the same security agencies that are targeting them. So on the one, it can be quite a humiliating experience. On the second, it puts this person at risk of extortion. We didn't document this in the report, but I've heard of several cases where officers will ask for bribes in order to get the name removed. I think that's happening less often now than it did in the past, but certainly something to think about. And then third, it might put this person in a position where they're then subject to interrogation again. They go to pick up their passport or try to get permission to travel, and they're interrogated. And not just, this was one of the cases we documented in the report, not just interrogated, where are you going, what are you planning to do, but blindfolded and, harassed and interrogated. One person that we spoke to described how she left this interrogation, sobbing, traumatized, walking down the streets, crying. And so I think that it underscores how difficult it is, not just from a legal perspective, not just from a logistical perspective, but really the hell that it puts a person through simply to try to seek to get this ban lifted. And why a lot of people don't, why a lot of people just end up saying, screw it, I would rather just live with this and live with these restrictions than put myself through the pain of trying to get them sorted.
Yeah, thank you guys for answering that question, I think there's a very interesting kind of devil's advocate question that somebody in the audience posed about us, being pretty vocal on this in this event about how there is no legal basis. Are there fears that the Egyptian government and other governments who practice travel bans might actually, clean up their act and put together a law and have a strict framework that allows for this practice to be legal within local law and to allow them to continue to do it? Any thoughts on that, Kareem? I see your hand up. Kareem, did you want to take that?
Oh yeah, sorry, you were on mute in the last thing you said. I noticed that question. I've got an answer for it, but please, if anyone else, I don't want to, completely dominate this Q&A. If anyone else has insight, please share. But I was particularly interested in that question because it is something that is constantly in our minds. Is that, is the constant talk about the absence of legal basis potentially dangerous? Yes, it is. But everything you do here in this context is potentially dangerous. And, that's why, as James mentioned, especially with travel bans and asset freezes, you're kind of outside prison. You spend a lot of time thinking, maybe this will be lifted eventually, but you can end up like being one of our colleagues that we named before, who's went on, for whom this has dragged for 5, 6, 7 years. And so you end up having to do something. That something can backfire. Everything you do in this context in Egypt can backfire. Let me give you an example. We had this for the last 4 or 5 years. The state has been increasingly using, it's in a different issue, that what has become highlighted quite frequently, the pattern of using pre-trial detention as a punishment in of itself. So basically putting people on cases. They tend to be terrorism cases for politically motivated reasons, and then they rot in pre-trial detention for more than the legal limit, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. People get recycled in these cases. That is very well documented, right? And it's very obviously unconstitutional and illegal, especially when they spend more than the maximum length of time allowed in the law for pre-trial detention. And then we kept raising this issue until finally in the last year, and that's one thing that's very clever about this pattern of persecution, is like fine, you want the law, we'll give you the law. So they had a bunch of people put on after spending 3-4 years in pre-trial detention where they're not being investigated, nothing is really happening. They put them on trial. A select few cases, like the case of Abdina Abu Futuh or Ziad Al-Alimi. They put them in trial, or even the case of Ala Muhammad Bakr, they put them in trial in an emergency court, and then they ended up with 4 or 5 years in prison. So it puts people in a very difficult positions. Like if we advocate for this, maybe they'll, as you said, maybe they will shape up and tighten the law, and then give you the law, and the law is very disproportionate and severe, and the case is made up, and then you'll end up in prison. That is, that's a fear that I have when we talk about travel bans, whether it's tightening travel bans in themselves, or even, might as well prosecute you and put you in trial. But you still got to do something about it, mostly because the uncertainty is just torturous. So you kind of get bored, and then you do something. It could be fruitful and it could backfire, but it's definitely a concern.
If I may, I would also add that it's an imperfect ask, right? Because we know there are cases where either bad laws are enshrined and then they normalize bad practices, or just vague laws are enshrined. But I want to underscore something Kareem said about the ambiguity and uncertainty. At least having a single law that clearly lays out who is issuing these bans, how they can be challenged, for how long, creates a framework through which to understand whether a law meets international standards, but then even whether a law meets the country's own domestic framework, and whether the practices that are in place are following that law. And it creates a slightly different conversation than what we have now, which is an arbitrary system, parallel tracks of an administrative decree and then a security sector, which is not governed by any law, and then kind of leaves us in this sense of ambiguity. The first question we get time and time again when we engage with policymakers is, so what's the law governing this? Or what's the legal recourse? Or what steps need to be taken? And the fact that nothing exists right now leaves us lost in these details. kind of lowers the quality of the conversation, if you will. I think a minimum, it's necessary but not sufficient to have a law that governs all travel bans, that defines travel bans as a measure of last resort, that prohibits the security apparatus from issuing travel bans and allows travel bans to be only issued in relationship to cases. There are, limited as they are, international standards around these issues. There are best practices, and I think we're not having that conversation enough. And that's perhaps a first step that needs to be taken. And it's something that was told to us by a number of the lawyers and civil society advocates engaging on this that they've been thinking about, albeit an imperfect solution, but a necessary one.
Allison, did you want to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to drive home the point that it shouldn't be an either or. Either we have this law or we try to apply political pressure. The law is one thing that needs to happen, whether it's a first step or a simultaneous step. And I think that one of the things that we've seen the Egyptian government has been very good at is focusing on legal reform without focusing on the political reform. So, okay, well, there's a problem with arbitrary detention. I mean, Kareem mentioned then we start seeing people actually be put through unfair trials, but also then the focus of whether it's the National Human Rights Strategy or the National Dialogue or what have you, is we're going to reform the laws around pretrial detention. We're going to make pretrial detention maximums only 6 months now instead of 2 years. Well, we know that's not the issue. I mean, the law that is on the books on pretrial detention itself is fine. It's the arbitrary application. It's the abuse of the law. Similarly, we've seen the same thing for years with the NGO law. We'll reform the NGO law. We'll put out different implementing measures. Well, it's not the issue of the law. It's the issue of how it's actually being interpreted and how it's being abused. So I do think that I just wanted to underscore that point, particularly for folks who are engaged in advocacy or policymakers. Yes, let's push for the law because that will help. It probably won't hurt. But then we also need to be pushing for the way that the law is interpreted as an exceptional measure, only used in certain cases where there is clear and justified need, in a way that we're not seeing right now at all.
Yeah, thank you for making that important point, Allison. I'm going to combine two questions from the audience, kind of about the types of people getting targeted by these bans. One was about how the travel bans affect dual citizens. So obviously we've talked about the US, we've talked about the UK, and there may be other countries here. The other question is about, the use of these travel bans to marginalize the LGBTQI+ community in Egypt. And I'm wondering if anybody can tackle both or either of those questions about those groups affected.
I can certainly discuss the issue of dual citizens. Yes, these bans affect dual citizens as well. We know of at least two cases of dual citizens who have been prevented from traveling despite being United States citizens. In one case, this was somebody who was attempting to travel with a US passport and was prevented from leaving. The issue is, as you know very well, Margot, while the US actually has strong legislation on the books that outlines a need for increased engagement and advocacy and coordination with those who may be, for American citizens or legal permanent residents, wrongfully detained abroad. That legislation has not been interpreted in a way that applies to those who are on travel bans abroad. This is also the case in Saudi Arabia, where we see there's 4 US nationals who are on travel ban. And so it's the same, we face the same challenges that we do for other advocacy for those who are on travel bans. So yes, it is a problem.
Go ahead, Kareem.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Alison says, and that also kind of relates to the issue about the legality and the legal vacuum. I mean, in theory, it should be that travel bans, like any other non-custodial measure linked to an ongoing legal investigation. It's like pretrial detention. You can detain dual citizens. You can detain not even dual citizens. You know, Egypt has. I mean, it's a basic sovereignty right. If someone is implicated in a case here, in theory, countries have the right to detain them. So the problem is not with whether they have the right to detain or issue travel bans. It's that they use it in a punitive manner, and they use it in a manner that is governed by a very weak or absent legal framework. I want to say, Alison, that I do think actually I agree with most of what you said, but I do think that it can hurt. Any legal reform that happens in Egypt today will definitely hurt someone. So I'm really scared. I mean, this is not just when it comes to travel ban. I'm talking about a legal reform. There are holes that need to be plugged. Travel ban needs to be treated at least like pre-trial detention, which is limited to a certain amount of time tied to an investigation. If within 2 years of an investigation you're not able to prove anything or put someone on trial, then you lift these measures. So the problem is really with how you, with the fact that there's this hole, but also with how you're applying it. You're disregarding the law when you're applying it, just as is the case with pre-trial detention. The law doesn't need to be reformed. We do have a very, very clear provisions on the maximum length for pre-trial detention, but they ignore it. And on the issue of the communities that are targeted by travel bans, it's a bit of a contentious issue, but so I'm not yes, there has been cases. The key thing to know about travel bans again is that it's usually used on a very individual basis, and sometimes it's subject to just individual whims. So we have cases, of people who've provided criminal defense for who are LGBT and who are being prosecuted on account of being members of the LGBT community. Some of them are allowed to travel. It's not an automatic thing. A lot of people think that travel bans are automatically tied to prosecution if you're released early from pre-trial detention. It isn't. People are put on travel bans for reasons that sometimes you can guess, and a lot of times you can't guess. And it usually has to do with someone either having international connections or because you feel like someone hasn't been punished enough, to be honest, and you want to punish them by making their lives difficult. So that happens with, political activists, journalists, members of the LGBT community. It's quite, I'm not at liberty to talk about specifics of cases, but yes, there are some cases like that we have worked on in our legal defense. And if you allow me, Margot, there's another question related to who is targeted, not just by travel bans, but also by the kind of work that we do. I'd like to take this opportunity to also answer that question, which is about ideological dispensation. Someone was asking a question about whether we only work on cases, because the caseload that we're talking about here, it might strike someone as being purely, mostly liberal activists or writers or whatever. I just want to say that before I got prosecuted, I used to be the director of criminal justice at EIPR, and most of our work, in the context of Egypt between 2015 and 2020 was on death penalty. And half of our caseload were Islamists, because those are the people who tend to be dragged in cases that end with death sentences, right? So this is what we worked on most of the time. It's just that with this particular community, you don't usually have the issue of travel bans. You have much more serious issues. That's the state's problem. It's not our problem, but we are not we didn't have that kind of ideological dispensation in making decisions about how we use our resources. We've represented a lot of people from different ideological backgrounds. But to be honest, we do get bogged down in our stuff. It might come across that we're mostly focused on us. And you know why? It's because in my organization alone, over the last 6-7 years, 6 people went to prison and spent various lengths of time in prison. And today, 5 people who are in this organization live with travel bans and asset freezes. And so, this is a very clever tactic that states use to waste your resources. You're bogged down in trying to defend yourselves, in trying to get your colleagues out of prison, like we did with Patrick and with my colleague Yara before, and then trying to get your own, because you can't really work in these, and trying to register with the NGO law, which we're willing to do, and trying to get our travel bans and asset freezes and other really restrictive measures lifted so that we can do our work. So I just want to say that we don't like the fact that we're constantly I don't like the fact that I have to advocate for myself. I do feel quite pathetic. I used to work in bigger issues. This is not how, what I thought I'd be doing 12 years into my career, but it's an inevitable byproduct of, this is why it's so clever when states target civil society in that manner, which is why it's an issue that is important to raise.
Thank you, Kareem. Alison, and then James.
I did just want to mention, because I think that this issue of ideological leanings is important, because for the work that we did, we actually did document cases of not only of Islamists, for instance, who are targeted with travel bans, but often family members as well. So this could be the daughter of somebody who's in prison, the wife, etc. In some cases, we documented where, for instance, a wife is detained in order to either coerce a husband who's abroad to come back to Egypt to be with his family, where he could then be detained, but she can't leave. So we have actually documented quite insidious ways that travel bans have been levied against other types of, say, political opposition other than civil society. But again, I think particularly with these cases, folks are very wary of coming forward. It's generally known that there's not as much sympathy, I think, in the international sphere for cases of, for instance, family members of Islamist Muslim Brotherhood leaders who might be detained, or them themselves. So I did just want to note that it is something that we have documented in some of these other, let's say, ideological communities, but it's just much less spoken of publicly.
Yeah, really, I mean, really just, I guess, a couple of things to sort of highlight which are linked, which is, I certainly think, I mean, for example, we did have one person we spoke to who, whose case I can't really share details of because we weren't able to, they weren't comfortable sharing their case, but at least one of the factors they felt that they were targeted both for arrest and then subsequently for a travel ban was because they didn't conform with kind of conventional gender identity norms. But like quite a few people, that we spoke to who weren't, reasonably prominent members of the civil society community, they weren't in a position, and a whole variety of factors that go into these decisions, they weren't in a position to kind of make their case public. And I do think that is, I just wanted to sort of support in a way what Alison has said there, that, there are a number of reasons why, I guess, certain members, certain human rights defenders and others, within the civil society community, they've kind of reached that stage, where it feels like a choice that makes sense, and others are not in that place for a whole series of factors that will be quite individualized, but also there is a bit of a pattern to it.
Yeah, thank you all for weighing in on that. We only have a few minutes left, or about a minute left, but there's a pretty important question I think would translate beyond to what was just asked. Someone asked, what is the response from USG officials when you raise travel ban cases? I'd be interested to hear, beyond just the US, if there are engagements with the UK government and others, noting what Alison said earlier about this kind of gap in addressing travel bans under legislation that the US has put out there on Americans wrongfully detained abroad. I do think people are focused on prisoners and they don't necessarily think of travel bans, but there obviously has to be somebody responsible and entities responsible for this if we are going to find solutions and apply pressure.
Very quickly, I think there's an awareness globally that travel bans are being used as a tool to silence dissent, to silence expression, as a form of reprisal. But there is a kind of calculus that's been talked time and time again throughout this conversation about what the most pressing issue is. And I think that leaves us in a complicated situation and creates a complicated advocacy environment. But I think if anything, I hope that those listening to today's event walk away with is that travel bans are part and parcel of the toolbox, and they are critical elements of the toolbox. They are the tools that allow for this kind of chill to exist for not 1 year or 2 years, but for years, 6 or 7, as we've heard in some of these examples. They're critical to understanding how the Egyptian authorities operate, and they are related in many cases to detention, whether they come after detention, whether they predate detention, or whether they just create a fear that detention may be possible in the future. And if we are affording detention that same attention, then we should also be thinking about the tools which facilitate that larger environment to exist. And so we've stressed, and I hope that the research that our organizations have collectively done, I hope, first of all, noting that the years of research and documentation that's been done by Egyptian civil society organizations that our work builds on and tries to draw attention on, that those consuming this in this latest wave understand just how serious this issue is, that you can't talk about closing cases without lifting travel bans and lifting asset freezes, and that this is part of the larger discourse. I hope that these travel bans isn't necessarily separated when we sit down and meet with Egyptian officials or our Egyptian counterparts, but rather that this is an issue that's raised as part of kind of a series of tools. It's certainly that important, and it certainly affects people's lives in a really existential manner.
I'll
Thank
jump in next.
you, May,
sorry.
for that.
Sorry,
Go
Margo.
ahead, Allison.
I think there was a lag. I'm going to try to jump in next so I don't get left being the last word. I agree with everything that May said. I think what our hope was with these reports and in sort of coordinating them around the same time is to give a little bit of an extra push to policymakers to underscore this is a very serious issue. Also to give them a little bit more concrete information that when they go to their Egyptian interlocutors, they can say these have been documented. This is, you know, as May mentioned, now we have years of different documentation around these bans. I think what we need to see more of is action. And so, you know, just speaking to the US side of things, we have a lot of leverage. We have a gigantic military financing package that we give to Egypt every year that can be better conditioned around not just releases of prisoners, but actually freedom for those who are released, including lifting of travel bans and asset freezes. And again, I want to reiterate, COP27 is just around the corner. This is a huge opportunity for engagement around the opening of civic space. One thing that was underscored already is that this is, for many, this is not just about those who are immediately banned from travel, but about the message that it sends to future generations. I think that there's a reason why we haven't seen, I mean, not just general participation, obviously from Egyptian civil society that's facing all of these repressive measures. But then if we think about how could a new generation tackle massive issues like climate change, like environmental degradation, when they can't even, when they're afraid simply to join organizations, right? So I do think that policymakers need to be thinking about these, pressuring for these measures, pressuring for lifting of travel bans now will not only help those whose rights are being violated immediately, but also a next generation that is going to be really critical to dealing with some of Egypt's and the region's and the world's massive future.
Thank you, Allison. So well said. I want to thank James, Allison, and May for their critical research on this. And I also want to thank Kareem for your bravery and sharing your story, because I do think it's going to help so many other people understand what this experience is like. And I hope will help us increase those pathways towards action that Allison mentioned. Turning it over to Audrey to wrap this up. Thank you again for having me. It's wonderful to be part of this discussion today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick, Kareem, James, Allison, and May, for your testimony and for a truly exceptional and timely conversation. Thank you, Margot, for moderating this discussion so well. As we mentioned at the beginning of the panel, today's conversation comes on the heels of a joint report published by TIMEP and the Freedom Initiative, which details Egypt's politically motivated and targeted abuse of travel bans. We invite you to read the full report and to continue to follow our work and that of the Freedom Initiative, as well as the work of each of our excellent panelists who you've heard speak today. To our audience, I want to thank you for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion. These conversations would not be the same without your engagement. You can follow TIMEP and the Freedom Initiative on Twitter and other social media to stay engaged with our work. You can reach out for any media requests by email at press@timep.org. You'll find this recording on our website and our YouTube channel. And as the Freedom Initiative mentioned in the chat, you can also subscribe to their mailing list. And finally, a huge thank you to both the TIMEP and the Freedom Initiative teams involved in making this event possible. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.